ערב טוב. אני פותחת את המושב הזה בעברית ואני תכף אעבור לאנגלית. אני צריכה לומר שאני מדברת ברגשות מעורבים. מצד אחד, עוד לא עברה חצי שנה מאז שתמר, עמיתתי חברתי מהיום הראשון ללימודים, עזבה את העולם הזה, ועשינו הרבה דברים יחד, בקשר לפולקלור, בקשר לתרבות נשים. הערב אנחנו הקדשנו את הדיונים בעיקר לתרומתה לחקר של תרבות נשים, תרבות עממית ותרבות נשים. והיא עסקה בזה הרבה מאוד ובתשוקה גדולה, וזה היה דבר מאוד חשוב בשבילה. ההשפעה שלה על חקר הפולקלור היהודי, במיוחד זה שבספרדית יהודית, כפי ששמעתם הערב, הוא ללא שיעור. וללא שיעור היא התחילה דברים שאף אחד לא עסק בהם קודם, היא השלימה מפעלים גדולים כמו מחקר של פתגמים בלדינו, מחקר של פתגמים בחקטיה יחד עם פרופסור בן-טולילה, והספר החשוב שלה על הסיפור העממי היהודי ספרדי שגם תורגם לאנגלית. מצד אחד העצב על לכתה, מצד שני השמחה על כך שיש דור חדש, ואתם שמתם לב שכל המרצים בעצם היו מדור תלמידינו של תמר ושלי, או אפילו תלמידינו במקרים מסוימים, והתחושה הזאת של התרחבות התחום, של העמקתו, לתמר יש, אני לא אומרת היה, אני אומרת יש, לתמר יש תרומה חשובה ביותר לדבר הזה. אני רוצה להודות למכון בן-צבי, אני רוצה להודות למרים פרנקל, אני רוצה להודות לאסף תמרי, אני רוצה להודות ליניב מזומן שהיה, ואני רוצה להודות לאפרת אבן, שבלעדי כולם לא היה הערב הזה מתקיים, ותודה שהקדשתם את הערב הזה לזכרה של תמר ולחוקרות והחוקרים הצעירים שממשיכים את דרכה. אני רוצה להודות גם לציבי הטובי שבעצם היא התחילה את כל הערב הזה, היא לא כאן אבל היא התחילה את כל הערב הזה. ההרצאות היו מעניינות, הן מכבדות את זכרה של תמר, הם היו ברמה גבוהה, הם היו מוכנים היטב, תודה רבה לכם על הערב הזה. After these short words about my colleague and close friend Tamar Alexander and her important impact on the study of folklore in Israel, it is my privilege and great pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished guest, Professor of Performance Studies and Folklore, Deborah Kapchan, all of whose shining achievements I will not be able to share with you. Her PhD studies at the University of Pennsylvania were inspired and supervised by the great master of multicultural and intercultural study, Roger Abrams. Many of her numerous publications highlight the mutual embeddedness of folklore and artistic creativity, particularly the arts of sound, both in the stricter sense of ethnomusicology and in a wider sense of the soundscapes of cultures. As in her path-breaking book, Gender on the Market, Moroccan Women and the Revoicing of Tradition, 1996, Deborah's rich personal ethnographic experience in Morocco makes her work particularly interesting for many here. And not less interesting for most of us is her serious inquiry into questions of complex and multi-layered identities while thoughtfully deconstructing the idea of homogeneous and cemented identities. She has taught at such strongholds of American folklore research as the universities of Indiana Bloomington and Texas Austin, and until recently as professor of performance studies at NYU's renowned Tisch School of the Arts. A recipient of both Guggenheim and Fulbright fellowships, in her present academic position, Deborah Kapchan serves as one of the star acquisitions of NYU's Abu Dhabi campus, you know, like Ronaldo in the Saudi Pro League, right? I'm very happy that she's here and that she consented to participate in this evening commemorating Tamar. And I'm very happy that she will share with us her thinking developed in her recent book, Poetic Justice, an anthology of Moroccan contemporary poetry 2020. Her musical instrument is the flute, once a humble reed, now shining in silver and gold. Please.
Thank you, Galית. Can you all hear me? I am so honored to be here. Thank you. So honored to be here. A little jet-lagged. I just arrived from New York yesterday. But many, many thanks to Galית, Hassan Rokam, to Miriam Frankel, to Efrat Evan, and everyone who is staying after all of these very fascinating presentations. I'm really privileged to be here, and Galית kind of gave me a clue to what they were about. I'm sorry I can't speak to you in Hebrew. Maybe one day. So let's see. This is a little tricky because it's not it's a PDF and not a PowerPoint. But here we go. So this is a picture of my latest publication. It's an anthology of Moroccan contemporary poetry that I've been working on since 1994, when a long time ago. It's truly been a labor of love. As you probably know, the Academy doesn't reward or value translation too much, so it's always been a sideline for me. Today, however, I'd like to talk about the role of ethnography in the process of translation and the necessity of not only being bilingual, but bicultural and bisensorial. That is, to immerse oneself in the sounds, smells, tastes, and feelings of another culture in order to engage poetic translation. And given the topic of this conference, I hope to bring home the role of the feminine in this aspect, the feminine aspect in this endeavor. Oops, this is why I mean it's going to be a little tricky. So I began my ethnographic explorations in the marketplace in Morocco with storytellers and orators, many of them women. Their narratives were replete with rhyme, parallelism, wit, and humor. And here you see the marketplace in Beni Mellal, which is the agricultural province of Morocco. It's 1990. It's not market day on the day I took this photo, so there are no tents, no vegetable sellers or hawkers. However, there is a storyteller there, Moulay Omar, surrounded by auditors in what we would call the halqa, that is the performance circle where audience and performers create and inhabit imagined worlds together. And here is a woman orator. She is a clairvoyant, a majduba, but she's also a wordsmith, hawking her potions in an elaborate multi-genre oratory that includes zejel, which is poetry in Moroccan dialect, often authored by Sidi Abdurrahman el-Majdoub, a poet and Sufi of the 16th century. I took this picture, it's hard to believe, 32 years ago. But what has happened to orality in the intervening years? Since then, storytellers have vanished. They don't want their children to be poor and thus encourage them to study and get a job with the government. Women's voices in the public sphere of marketplaces, in fact, in general, have disappeared completely. They are replaced by supermarkets. And women's voices in the public sphere, of course, still exist, but we find them in parliament, as doctors and lawyers, and as teachers, but they're no longer in the halqa, as you see here. And what about zejel, or poetry in dialect? In 1990, Morocco was in the throes of an Arabization process, the shedding of French in schools and the valorization of not just classical Arabic as a means of instruction, but Moroccan Arabic as a literary language. Moroccan Arabic, not classical. It began to be written. What's more, poets were consecrating their poems to print, like this poem by Idris Misnawi. Our business is to count the stars, star by star, nijma, nijma, to chew the wind's haughty arrogance and watch the clouds for when they'll throw us a handful. And if the earth goes far away from us, we'll say everyone is possessed, everyone has lost their mind, and time, never will its letters fall between our hands until we write what we are. My understanding of translation began in ethnography, in writing what and who we are in order to better understand time. The lessons I learned were simple but profound. Translation is inseparable from the flesh of ethnography. It relies on the recontextualization of the oral canon. Intersemiotic translation is as vital as logos, that is, the body is extremely important. And it is in learning to listen that we can transduce, truly embody what is unlike ourselves. Let's begin with ethnography, and I will shorten this a bit. I know we're all tired. So translation and the flesh. What is ethnography? What does it do? I refer to it as the flesh, drawing on Merleau-Ponty and his use of the term chair, flesh. Flesh is material. It is permeable. It is inner and outer. The flesh of words and the flesh of the world intersect and create one another. It is perceptual, sensorial, metaphoric. It requires embodied engagement. Translation is always ethnographic. This is Ahmed Lemsiyah, the first poet to publish in Moroccan Arabic. His verses are densely weighted in the particular, replete with proverbs, song lyrics, and history. I went down in my soul to look for the remains. I found happiness defending spring. I said a head without a strategy deserves to be severed, and I chanted. Two pigeons singing, they sleep on the palm fronds. He who doesn't love beauty, his life is lamentable. He who has a little gazelle should keep his hand upon it. One person hawks his life, another is the pawnbroker. Lemsiyah goes down in his soul, ruh, to look for the remains, and what he finds are verses that exist in the oral canon. The first of the couplets is based on a proverb, ras bla neshwa katiu al-halal, a head without passion, its severing is permitted. Lemsiyah replaces the letter waw in neshwa with the letter ba and alters the verse slightly. Ras bla neshba itzehel l'qtiya, a head without a strategy or trap, presumably for one's enemies, deserves to be severed. Here he comments on the need to be attentive to the silent battle of those in power. silence has become their weapons, he says in another line. The second of the two couplets recall verses from the genre of al-alwa. Here we go. A genre performed by women, called women or shikhat in Morocco. Two pigeons singing, they sleep on the palm fronds. جوج حمامات يغنيوا فوق نحلة يباتوا لما عشق الزين يتعزى في حياته لي عنده شي غزيل يحط ايدي عليه واحد يرحن عمره والآخر يتولي فيه. He who doesn't love beauty, his life is lament. Employing song lyrics in the popular repertoire, Lemsia reframes and recycles the remains of oral culture into the written word. The lively responses of the audience when I heard him perform this poem were a reaction to this play between what can be cited, words, and the unspoken affective depths associated with them. The delight of the audience registered the recognition of their own bilingualism between the written word and the oral repertoire. So, in other words, women's oral songs were behind his written words. Lemsia's verses play with parallel structures well known in oratory performed in the Moroccan halqa, the oral performance circle traditionally found in the marketplace. And these are words I recorded in the halqa. Words are a path, and people, these are words from his poem, which recall those words. Words are a path, and people are letters. Words are not true or false. Words are a spring whose water circumambulates. Paper is a shroud sewn with white. Writing enables the eye to see, and the kaftan to be dotted with life. Its clothes pure. Its meaning is wool. When you spin it, you find your love entangled. Bargaining is rapture, joy, and fear. Wear fragrance and plain the senses. Feather the wind. Leave the sky plucked. The paper's blood is mixed with ink. Its life doesn't want to stop. So compare those words with the words that I recorded in the halqa. Imra ashkat simma, a woman, what is she called? Bir urajal kid simma dlu, a woman, a well, and a man is called a bucket. Imrakat simma dwaya urajal kid simma qalam. Imrakat simma hod urajal kid simma segiya. Imrakat simma fresh urajal kid simma urta. Clearly, Lemsia has spent time in the halqa. He alludes as well to Sufism, to religious purification, and the practice of circumambulation of the Kaaba during the Muslim pilgrimage. The associative density and parity present in Lemsia's recycled verses present profound resistance to translation. Had I not done extensive research on both shikhat and oratory in the marketplace, these allusions and citations may have remained completely invisible to me. And even so, it was a reaction of the audience at the performance of these poems that first alerted me to the presence of meanings that might otherwise have eluded me. So the performance context is an essential aspect to poetic interpretation, even when the event happened in the past. The performance context, the presence of orality and other forms of embodied history abide and sometimes hide in the written word, and thus, and this is where the PowerPoint would have come in handy, the performance context is an essential aspect to poetic interpretation. Embodied, here we go. You can read. And I am. So the embodied cultural knowledge is required in order for cultural depths to rise to the surface. That is, the translator must not only be bilingual, but embrace a bisensoriality sensitive to the flesh of multiple worlds and what lies between them. I'm going to skip a little bit. So there are many, I'm going to skip translation as recontextualization and move forward a little bit to the gesture of language. Continuing with what resists translation. This is a poem by Rashid Mumni. Like many modern poets, Mumni uses the space on the page to express the rhythm and movement of the poem. This can be duplicated in the translation. What resists translation, however, are the qualities that are transmitted in the writing itself, that is, the handwriting. For like many poets, past and present, Mumni adopts an old form of Arabic script, a style of calligraphy that dates from at least the 18th century. What's more, his poems are also accompanied by paintings done in ink. Each poem has its correspondent image. For Mumni, these elements are all part of an integral and interdependent poetic expression. There are many styles of Arabic calligraphy, each indexing a particular historical moment and style and school. Mumni employs a particular Moroccan script, or khat, that was popular several centuries ago in both scholarly and religious texts. The calligraphers of the period did not erase the inked notes, but added additions, titles in the margin, leaving a trail of their thought processes. Mumni evokes the presence of history by sometimes writing his titles perpendicular to the text, requiring the readers to actually turn the page in their hands in order to read the poem. Readers are thus involved in the tactile dance of body and text. The script Mumni employs is one that enlarges some letters in relation to others and fluctuates in the thickness of the line. The density and inconsistency of letter size make its reproduction in type difficult. In the tension and flair of the lines, it expresses the personality of the artist. The form of both the word and the poem on the page contributes to the meaning of the poem as a whole, like gesticulation adds to language. What's more, Mumni uses the same ink in his calligraphy as he does in his paintings. His poem paintings are a materialization of the imaginal world of barzakh, he says, the intermediary realm between the flesh and spirit, where the imagination begins to condense into material form, and where material forms are spiritualized, understood as symbols on the path to gnosis. The ink painting that accompanies the poem, The Key to Absence, here, brings the reader's gaze into the twisting lanes of the old city. There is a doorway in the center of the painting, archways are visible, and the chiaroscuro that distinguishes the streets from the walls reflects the absence and presence that thematize the poem. In the text itself, Mumni stresses the word affects, imbuing the inked lines with the weight of history. Although the sediment of time is swept clean with light, it still lives in the hidden melodies, the shadows. Like many Moroccan poets, Mumni draws heavily upon Sufi symbolism and metaphor, the concept of absence as a spiritual state being particularly salient. Absence from earthly realities signals a presence to the divine. Absence is the home of the seeker, a residence whose balcony beckons. What hidden melodies nearly awaken the twisting lanes, the doors and the slumbering roofs? What effects will be written on the earthen stairs, swept clean with a broom of light? What returner does that balcony hasten home, hanging for thousands of years like a key to absence? Absence lives behind the doors of the labyrinthine streets of the Fez Medina. He alludes to the pre-Islamic poetry called the hung odes, the mu'alakat, that are said to have been hung over on or in the Kaaba of Mecca, referencing as well the epic 1001 Nights. How create the affective depths carried by local metaphors into language and culture? How conjure the effects fabricated from the smell of ink, the curve of a line, the sound symbolism specific to a particular ethos, the architecture embedded in the image? Translation is an ethnographic genre. I think for time's sake, I will skip this as well, though I will, you all know Khatibi, the calligraphic letter is not entirely a letter, but something that sits between writing and music. So Geli referenced my recent work, or recent, that is, in the last decade, I've been working on sound, and usually I have some music to play or some audio, but today not. However, in sound studies right now, the metaphor, the trope of transduction is very, very important. That is how sound comes into the ear, makes the cilia, the little hairs in our ears dance, and is translated, of course, into meaning in our brain. Translation is, in fact, like listening, a process of transduction, a medium of translation. Translation is not ethnography, yet it relies on an ethnographic sensibility if it is to embrace and not smother the author. Nor is anthropology translation, at least not in any facile linguistic sense that assumes equality and transparency. Rather, I suggest that ethnography and translation are twin endeavors, inseparable events, intimate paramours, enfleshments. Translation for me has been a lifelong project, the enigma of my very existence. Ethnography is translation, and we're constantly translating other cultures and languages into our own. Let me end then with a return to orality. Oh, and that's the video that we don't have on the PDF. Let's see if it's here. Let me return then to end with the poem of Rashida Madani. Rashida Madani is a very feminist poet. She is, I think, one of Morocco's most illustrious poets. And I'm going to have to read it on the screen with you. Can you see it? No. It's too. I can. I'll read it. I'll read it to you, and we'll end here. I leave them the period, the comma, all the punctuation and know-how. For a while now, I've no longer surprised myself, no longer questioned myself, no longer stopped myself. I am no longer a poet, just the oasis and the doe that you dream of, pilgrim, my old brother. My words have become livid on the Milky Way of your fantasies, insomniac cities where I lose my name. I hug your walls, my delirium conjugated with your fountains, my mouth on the mouths of your sewers, where I vomit the detritus of an aborted poem. From where can I climb to the sky, the one spontaneous cry of a destroyed woman, emptied of herself, agonizing? Woman, I haven't finished dreaming of my childhood, haven't finished lifting each star, on the path of expectation, sentinels watching over my cemeteries, where I sit without counting the tombs, without saying anything, watching for your return. Pilgrim, my old brother. And there we go. Oh, there it is in French. So Rashida Madani writes in French. She writes in French. Folklorists often follow orality into the written word. With this project, which, as I said, has been more than a 30-year project, I follow the written word back into its roots of orality, and I hope shown you a little bit of the fact that women's orality kind of exist at the fundamental base of that. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Deborah. This connection between, I want a long talk with you about the connection between ethnography and translation, but it will not happen here, don't be afraid. Fortunately, Professor Liat Cozma has agreed to step way beyond her usual spheres of activity and do what we do in poetry, leap into something we don't know, right? And I'm very grateful that she has agreed to reflect on your paper. Liat Cozma is a historian of the modern Middle East and associate professor at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, the Harry Friedenwald Chair for the History of Medicine. Her works include Policing Egyptian Women, Sex, Law, and Medicine in Khedival, Egypt, and 2011, and Global Women Colonial Ports, Prostitution in the Interwar Middle East, 2017. Liat has also been, or is she still, the head of the Nehemiah Lev Zion Center of the Study of Islam, which you led very well, and it was a wonderful time when you organized interesting things there. And she has also been the grantee of the very prestigious ERC grant, where she has focused on the research of the history of medicine in the Middle East and involved many students and young scholars in this project, which is very recommendable. I'm very proud of the young women at the Hebrew University nowadays. So please, Liat.
I'm going to step down.
Thank you.
I would actually, I prepared some notes. I want to start actually autobiographically. I started my my career as a scholar, as an MA student in the history of Moroccan feminism. And Professor Kapchan's work was one of the first books I read cover to cover sometime in the late 90s. So this is one thing I wanted to say. And the other thing, that I have two hats, one which I wear normally, which is the hat of the historian, and then the hat that is somewhere hidden in my closet, which is that of the translator. And I sometimes do that, and the introduction to your book and then your talk made me pull it out of the closet, dust it a little bit, and I want to comment on your observations about ethnography as a translator, because I always say, and always used to say, that as a translator and as a historian, I'm more of a vessel or a pipe through which actual knowledge moves from one place to the other, but I don't have any agency in this story. And I sometimes say that as a historian, I'm better as a research assistant. I know how to trace the sources, and then somebody else can do this intellectual labor, because what I want to do is to transmit the past into the present. And when what you're talking about, the ethnography of the translator reminds me of how we always say that we don't have to do field work because our informants are safely dead, and because what we do is far away anyway. It doesn't matter if we go there and live in the society in which we write about, because we're not going to meet our informants anyway. But I did that. I lived 1 year in Egypt during my PhD research. I visited the archives 5 times a week. My kids were in a local daycare. And I think that part of what I did was in my research, which was about women in the margins in 19th century Egypt, was also related to the way I was a mother in Egypt at that time. And one of the things I did during this year is translate a novel by Mohammed Barada, like a summer that will never return or repeat. And he was a student in Egypt in the 1950s, and I was a graduate student doing research in Egypt in 2003 and 4. And the way I thought about this novel and translated it was related to my experience, and my experience of Egypt was colored by this man who is a student in Egypt in 1956. This is the summer he's talking about, and then coming back there in the 70s, and Egypt is not the Egypt he remembers, and I'm coming back to Egypt in the 2000s, and the Egypt he talks about in the 50s and in the 70s is not the one I see. But then there's something about my present-day reading of the novel, which adds another layer, because I'm now not that young, I'm now the 50-year-old woman reflecting on the visit to Egypt in the early 2000s. So what I'm saying is that what your presentation and your introduction made me think about is how very embodied my experience as a historian and as a translator is. My second attempt in translating a novel, the first one was published 17 years ago, but the second one is a novel I didn't finish translating. It was written by a student of mine, a graduate student of mine, and it was about his experience as a Palestinian student at the Hebrew University. It won a very prestigious award of Kapchan Foundation. And reading how the Hebrew University looks like from his end, and then translating it as his former professor looking at Arab students from my end, was a very, I was constantly reflecting on who the original audience of this novel is, and then who the audience of my translation might be. I mean, his original audience criticized him for writing a novel about an Arab student at the Hebrew University. Why aren't you writing about an Arab student in the Palestinian university? And here, these are these things that I understand, but then most of the readers would not. So how do I do that? How do I... Anyway, I stopped translating it because I thought the novel needed an editor, and I'm not an editor. And shortening it would not be right. But I don't know, maybe I'll go back to it at some point. So I didn't plan this talk to be autobiographical at all, but I sat listening to you after having read your introduction, and I was moved to tears, and I'm trying to explain why. So just several short comments I did write down. So one of them is the visibility and the invisibility of the translator, and this is something that I used the metaphors of pipe and vessel, and I think this is how I value myself as a translator, if I can be invisible, but maybe you made me rethink, and then I liked what you said about translation as trust, what it means to be human together, and I think it's very true about translation and trying to find a common ground. Maybe as also history writing, trying to find a common ground between what made sense to people at that point in time because we shared a humanity. And there are things I cannot understand about the ways in which they reacted and how they responded to things. So I should think harder and imagine harder because we're human together. And I think it's the kind of history I do, which is a social history. And so a history of the body is very much looking at putting myself in other people's shoes in this way. What you said about French and Derrida and classical Arabic made me think about Palestinian writing in Fusha and Ammiya and in Hebrew. And I was thinking about the different meanings of being a post-colonial Moroccan poet writing in French and a Palestinian poet writing in Hebrew. And what does he do when you know Hebrew? I'm thinking about my students writing some of their papers in English and in Hebrew and in Arabic. And where do you feel most at home? And where can you, or a student of mine who based his thesis on interviews, and he wrote them down in Ammiya, and then wrote the word in formal Arabic, in classical Arabic, modern standard, on brackets so I can understand that. So what is it, what's similar and what's different and in these choices of the semi-colonial or whatever you want to call it, and then the post-colonial? And when can you choose to write in Hebrew or in French or in English? And in the case of North Africa, I had this conversation years ago with Fatima Siddiqui, Professor Fatima Siddiqui, in Fez University, and she said, people are criticizing me about choosing English as my specialization, but I was born speaking, I grew up speaking Tamazight, and then Arabic was imposed on me, and then French was imposed on me by the colonizer, and English is the language I choose. And I'm thinking about the different meanings of such choices, of which language do you feel most at home in. And the last comment is about heteroglossia, and we heard here about Facebook and the Ladino and in Hebrew, and I'm thinking about a talk I heard in Fez many years ago about how the social media brings in, like, adds English to the heteroglossia of Moroccans thinking in Arabic, in Derrida, in French, in English. So I was wondering whether you see this kind of heteroglossia in other spaces as well. That's it.